Hello class, these are our survey of algebra notes for section 5.1. We're looking at talking about domain and range, and then also discrete or continuous. And so this is going to be a pretty small thing, discrete or continuous. We'll continue on talking more about that this week. So domain is all of our possible x values. So domain is going to be our input. Our range is all of our possible y values. That's going to be our output. And the reason I say input and output is if we think about y equals mx plus b, we like to substitute something in for x, and then our answer after we do this number times x and then we add, our answer is going to be the y. So that's our output. So we're putting something in for x, we're getting something out for y. That's the way that equation is set up. So discrete is when a relation is not continuous. So instead of drawing a continuous line, the graph may look dotted or contain specific points. So discrete is going to be important if we're looking at something that's maybe a little more real life. Like maybe you're looking at a graph that has to do with people or animals or arms or legs or even cans of paint that you buy at the store. So those are things that we can't have fractions of. I can't have 1.5 people. And that's why we would talk about discrete. When we're finding our domain and range, and that's really our focus today, we're going to list the values in order from least to greatest. So they give us a little example here. They tell us they have an arrow drawn. Domain is all of our x's. We know that. And so our domain is 0 and 1 here. So then we go over here and we list that domain. And we use these fancy brackets around it to show we have a set of numbers. We do the same thing for range. Our range was 4 and 8. Those are just our y values. Again, we're just listing them out. So let's try that up above. So the first thing they want us to do is find the domain and range. And so here are all my x values. We know that's going to be our domain. So all I have to do now is list those in numerical order. And it looks like they already are. They have a negative number first, then 0, and then these are increasing. So let's just write them down. On the second one, we have, I say second one, but I mean for the second part on range, they've got all of our y values listed, but this time they're not in increasing order. Because if we look at negatives, right, and you think about the number line, negative 36 is going to be way over here on my number line. If I've got 0 here, negative 30 would be a little bit closer. So they're actually in the reverse order. So let's go ahead and write all of the range numbers down. So I'm finding for most students today, the trickiest part is actually writing them in the correct order. So go ahead and pause right now, and you should go ahead and try to do number 2 on your own. So just pause the video, and then when you turn it back on, or when you start it again, when you replay it, I'll have the second one done. So go ahead and try question 2. So hopefully you got the right answer on this one. Again, the tricky part is maybe not just identifying the domain and range, but listing them in order. And I wanted to kind of keep with my highlighting pattern here to make really clear what we're doing. So I'm always highlighting my domain in pink and my range in green, just so that you can see that. And that's the way I put the answer key on Canvas as well. So on the next one, the domain and range, we're finding those again. It said do that for all of the problems 1 through 7. But what's trickier on this one is now they're listing them as ordered pairs. So let's remember that an ordered pair is an XY. And so really when I'm looking at my domain, when I'm looking at my X's, it's all of these first numbers before the comma in those ordered pairs. And when I talk about my range, it's going to be the second number, the Y value for each ordered pair. And now again, we need to list them in order. So if I'm listing them in order for the pink ones, let's see, -8's the smallest, and then -1, and then 0, and then 3. So again, we're just identifying our domain right now, just from ordered pairs, tables, graphs. That's our goal today. For range, let's see, I only have one negative. The range is kind of interesting. They have the number 2 twice in an ordered pair, but I only need it to write it down once. There's only one number 2, so I don't want to list it more than one time. We'll try one more together, and then I'm going to have you pause the video and try 4 on your own. Or sorry, 5 on your own, but we'll go ahead and do 4. So for same thing, I'm going to go through and highlight all of my X values. That's my domain. And then I'm going to go through and highlight all of my Y values. My Y values are my range. So remember, we're always substituting something in for X and getting something out for Y. So ordered pairs are XY. They are in alphabetical order. So now let's see. For domain, there's two negatives, a -6 and a -3. So -6 would go first, then -3. And then we have 4 and 5. All right, for our range, let's see. We have a -4, and then a 0, and then 2 and 12. So I'd like you to go through and try number 5 right now on your own. Go ahead and pause the video. So you should be checking your answers on 5, and then we'll go through and do 6 together. So 6 is a little bit trickier. First, I have to come up with the ordered pairs. So in our first problems that we tried, they had the X's and Y's in rows for us. Domain and range were really easy. Here we had to remember how to look at ordered pairs and find X and Y. And now we've got to go back and actually remember how to find ordered pairs in the first place. So each of these problems is a little bit more difficult than the last. So I need to go ahead and figure out my X and Y values. So I'm going to start with this point right here. Looks like my X's are 1, 2. So this is a 2 for X. And then let's see, my Y value is a 5. So remember, when I'm looking at an ordered pair, it's always an X, comma, a Y, which is backwards from slope. From slope, we did rise over run. So when I'm graphing, though, when I'm plotting a point, I'm saying 2 and then up 5. So it is backwards. This one over here is over 1, 2, 3 on the x-axis, but I haven't gone up or down. So that one's 3, 0. This point right here is -2 and up 2. Trying to use marker on this so it's really clear. This point right here is down 1 from the middle, but I didn't go right or left. So it's going to be 0, comma, -1. The -1 is the y value because it's -1 on the y-axis. This last one here is -1 and then down 1, 2, 3. So -1, -3. All right, now that we've got this done, let's go back and look at domain and range. So remember, our domains always are x's. I just highlighted the wrong one. I'll go back over it with green. And our range is always our y's. There we go, fixed it. So when I am looking at my domain, I want to list them in order for x's. And so if I think about my x number line, it's going this way. So this is the point that's furthest left. So that's going to give me my smallest x value. So it'll start with -2, and then -1, and then 0, and then 2, and then 5. So I went in order across. Actually, was that a 5? No, that's a 3 right here. I went in order across like the direction of my x-axis to get those values in order. Now when I go ahead and list, and did I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yep, I've got them all. When I go to list my range, I want to think about my y-axis, and y-axis starts small and goes up. So I want to start like bottom and go up. So this would be -3 first, and then -1, and then 0, and then 2, And now I'm going to write down the 5. So for the last one, we have a word problem. So with word problems, the first time I like to go through and just read it once. My second time, I'm trying to really come up with some kind of a picture. And then the third time, I really want to focus in on those numbers. I want to really actively engage with word problems and make sure I understand what's going on with them. So you're going to notice that I make a lot of like silly comments when we're doing a word problem, and that we probably talk a lot about it, but that's because we're trying to really understand the situation and the words and the math. John needs $60 to buy a new video game. John decides to sell his older games for $12 each. The function P of x equals 12x represents his revenue for selling his old games. What is the domain and range of the function when P of x represents the revenue in dollars for selling x video games? All right, now we're going to try it again. John needs $60 to buy a new video game. So the first thing that I think of when I read that is I had no idea that video games were so expensive. And my students are assuring me that some of them are well over $100. So I need to, I had no idea. So I can see why he's going to have to save up or do something to buy this new video game. So John decides to sell his older games for $12 each. The function, and you might not really know what a function is yet in math. It's a special kind of relationship between x and y. So we'll talk about that more in the coming weeks. And then we read this P parentheses x, we read that as P of x. And we're going to learn more about that next week also. So the function P of x equals 12x represents revenue. And so this is where I had to pause in class and talk about how revenue is really the profit. That's the money that he's making for selling his old games. What is the domain and range of the function when P of x represents the revenue in dollars for selling X video games? Okay, so one thing I want to do right now before I even start thinking about domain and range is kind of go through some of these numbers. And this $60, if we're supposed to be analyzing this function, we don't even need that $60. It's setting it up, it's kind of giving us some information about the problem, but it's not necessary. They're telling us our X is going to be video games. So our domain is going to be our number of video games. So I want to make that a little note over here. Number of video games. That's a number sign, not a hashtag. And then my range is that P of X. That's like my Y value. So they're using that instead of writing a Y. And that's my revenue. So this is going to be money. So my domain is my number of video games. My range is my money. So when I'm figuring out the domain for something, I always want to think about, can it be negative? Can it be zero? Can it be positive? Can it be fractions? So if I'm looking at my domain and my domain is my number of video games, can it be negative? And that doesn't make sense, does it? But can it be zero? It makes sense that he could have zero, especially if he sells a bunch of them, right? He might not have any video games left to sell. Could his video games be 1 or 2 or 3? That also makes sense. But it does not make sense for him to have anything between these numbers, between 0 and 1 or between 1 and 2. He can't sell half a video game. Now, I don't know how many he has, so I'm going to make a comma after this 3, and then I'm going to make these dots to show that that goes on, and then I'm going to close my brackets. And just because I'm feeling a little bit fancy and I'm thinking about our vocab, you'll notice that because we can't have fractions, we have discrete values here. And that's because we're looking at whole video games. Now our range is going to be our money. So this is where we have to really look and analyze this formula. So if I'm looking at this P of x equals 12x, and I could really think of it as y equals 12x if I wanted to, that might help. If he sells one video game, we would have 12 times 1, we'll have $12. If he sells 2 video games, if that's my input, 12 times 2 would be $24. If he sells 3 video games, 12 times 3 would be $36. So over here, when I set up my range, my first number is going to be 0, but the next number is going to be 12 because he can't make a profit of $10. Not if he's selling them for $12 each. It's going to have to be these multiples of 12 that we've identified. So next it's going to be 24 and then 36, and I'm going to do the same thing and put some dots on this one as well. So these are our notes for domain and range for section 5.1. Make sure you ask questions in class if you have them.